Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. All the girls at the Institute were in love with Anthony. Nancy herself did not see him until her third year. She didn't participate much in the social and recreational life of the Institute. Nancy went to work from the first day of school to make a living. The rest of the time she studied. If she had a spare minute, she spent it on her self-development, sports, and cultural program. She was not up to conventional entertainment. In addition, she was never a fashionista, and all the girls around Anthony, for some reason, thought they should look the latest fashion and nothing else. Nancy didn't fit into that circle at all. Anthony was one of the Institute's main Methodists. He had studied here himself a couple of years before and maintained a very warm relationship with the faculty and administration, even after graduation. He was on the board of trustees and enjoyed attending various student recitals. At one, where Nancy was dragged by her friend Jenna, she saw Anthony. He was giving a speech from the stage, wishing the students a good school year. All the girls in the audience sighed at his every word. And at first Nancy, and it seemed more amusing than interesting. But by the end of the evening, she realized that just like everyone else, she couldn't take her eyes off Anthony. Nancy didn't think of it as love at first sight. She wasn't sure she was in love at all. She just imagined Anthony as the man of her dreams, even though she knew very little about him. But Jenna, who lived practically in the Institute, was happy to take Nancy with her to all her events. When she had the time, of course, a couple of words were exchanged with Anthony. "Why are you carrying these boxes by yourself? It's not right." He was there all of a sudden, so everything didn't fall on the floor. Anthony helped her carry the heavy boxes with the decorations inside. And despite the fact that he was rich, very busy with the affairs of the family business, a large successful company, where he helped his father and already managed several projects himself, Nancy seemed to think he was a very nice man. She saw him as quite simple, outgoing, and cheerful. He didn't look down on anyone. He was polite, courteous, and of course, possessing countless girls in love with him. However, Nancy certainly understood that neither she nor any other admirer of Anthony's would be together. It was as if she could physically sense that they were from different worlds, the difference in their situation, though there was no apparent reason for it. That's why Nancy would never even dare to communicate her interest in Anthony in any way. And while she thought, came the last year of her studies, all the time was busy with the practice and then writing a diploma. And no one canceled work. Jenna began to participate less in various events from the Institute, and alum Nancy did not really want to go there. But still, when she heard that everyone was going to the club after the university championship sports, and that Anthony, of course, would be there too, she came by herself without an invitation. The club was stuffy, and everyone was dancing, pushing, and shoving. Lilac blue spotlights were hitting her eyes, but she wasn't interested in drinking, dancing, talking to anyone, unless it was all with Anthony. She searched her eyes for him, refusing the offers she got from the guys she passed next to, though it was getting harder and harder to do as she made her way deeper into the club. She wore a beautiful red sleeveless dress, high stilettos, and even thought of a simple but very appropriate hairdo, tucking her hair into a bun, which was not her usual look. But she so wanted to at least talk a little longer with her boyfriend, who had been on her mind lately. And hello, you're alone. Here a tall young man appeared in front of Nancy, not quite sober anymore. "No, I'm looking for my boyfriend." Nancy wasn't in the mood for introductions. She didn't think she could be interested in anyone other than Anthony at all, and was just waiting for the moment when this interest would pass and she could start something serious with someone more available. Where did he run off to? "It's such a beautiful girl," the guy kept up. "He's around here somewhere, I just." Nancy turned her head looking for Anthony, and then suddenly she felt a palm on her shoulder. And there you were looking at her smiling, and as always beautiful Anthony. "My boyfriend is here. Have a good evening." Nancy winked and lost her boyfriend in front of her and grabbed Anthony's hand, which was again uncharacteristic of her, dragged him away from the crowd at the table. "So we're already dating," chuckled Anthony. "Let's at least get to know each other a little better first." "I'm sorry, he's a pain in the ass." Nancy brushed him off. "Do you have a boyfriend?" Anthony moved closer to the girl. "No, I don't have a boyfriend." Nancy even blushed a little at this attention, but it was dark in the club, and she was able to pretend she wasn't attracted to Anthony. So much for great news for all the available guys. "Would you like a drink?" Of course, Nancy didn't really know how to drink, much less in a place like this. But would any girl in her right mind refuse such an offer? Anthony, of course not. "But come on, tell me how you're doing. We've known each other a long time, but I don't know anything about you. You're always running around so fast, I don't even have time to say a word." Anthony deftly threw his arm behind the back of the couch and has already managed to bring it lower, laying Nancy on her shoulders. "I just work hard to get my head around this world somehow." She was already afraid to move and ruin this beautiful moment, straining a sweet cocktail through a tube and trying to enjoy the moment. It might never happen again, and she understood that. "I work hard too, but you have to make time to relax. Of course, you might have a different opinion on that. I agree with you, but I guess our jobs are different. You're your own boss," she grinned. "No, there are superiors above me too. I'm not such a major." Anthony was very relaxed, cheerful, and seemed different, even simpler and within reach. She considered his blue jacket and the gray t-shirt with the pattern underneath. "I don't think you're a major. You're a good man, so it seems to me." And Nancy completely lost her head at his intonation. "Oh, that's nice." The evening was going great. It had really been a long time since Nancy had relaxed like that, had not forgotten all the hardships of life, and had not spent time in such pleasant company. Anthony really seemed even better than she thought. He did charity work, read a lot, was into sports, traveled the world. And in general, it felt like he was living the life of a dream. Nancy asked more questions than she told herself, and she couldn't believe she was getting this chance. No one bothered them, and she didn't have to share Anthony's attention with anyone. They joked and laughed a lot, so much so that the girls' cheeks were already sore after they went outside. Anthony called a cab and offered to go to his place, and Nancy, of course, agreed. After that incredible evening, Nancy walked around spirited girlfriends. She did not talk about anything, and she did not have time. Work took up a lot of time. She worked as a waitress at events. It wasn't a full-time job, but it was perfect for a student. Now with summer coming up, there were more weddings. People were celebrating anniversaries and graduations outdoors or on outdoor terraces, so there was more work to do. Sometimes they exchanged messages with Anthony. He texted that he was away now, but still wondered how Nancy was spending her days. That was good enough for her. She didn't want to pry, asking where he was, why he hadn't told her he was leaving, or if they'd see each other again. She'd seen Jenna's questions achieve nothing but a breakup. She and Anthony were to each other, essentially nothing, and she didn't want to ruin that fragile bond between them. Nancy was writing her thesis, going out with her friend Jenna at the cafe theater at the expo, went jogging in the nearby park. Graduation was due soon, and the dormitory would be discontinued. She was looking for a more permanent job. Her life was filled with lots of emotions, experiences. Everything was going great. When she started to feel nauseous in the morning, she didn't pay attention. Paying attention waved goodbye to the heartburn. Mood swings. But when she got dizzy on a run in the park, so much so that passers-by offered to help and took her to the shade, wanted to call an ambulance. Nancy was worried sick. Still, she had to go to the doctor. She was worried that if it could be some kind of cold, she had no money for medicine. Neither did she have time to take a sick day. While she waited on the couch in the office, she was shaking her leg and biting her lips all over. "You are 10 weeks pregnant." The doctor smiled and prescribed vitamins, and Nancy just listened to it all and couldn't even get one thought out of the 1 million questions that were swirling around in her head. How to parent. On what? Where to live? Where would she take the baby while she was at work? What would she do with him at all? How to be a mother, how to give birth, and where to give birth. Her head was ready to crack. It was Anthony's baby. They were still communicating. But was it possible to just write to him about it? And would he believe it? There were hardly any occasions in his life when girls wanted to arrange their lives that way. She didn't want to be insulted. She didn't want to prove anything, but she did want to believe that if Anthony knew, he might be glad, and she didn't want to crush those dreams of hers. She worried that he might talk her into having an abortion, and she knew that if she was going to make that decision, it would only be with me. How can I advise you, Jenna? When Nancy told her everything. I was shocked, but she didn't talk her way into an abortion. She also wanted a different fate for her best friend. But they both understood who Nancy was. Ordinary beggar student coming from a small town, barely making ends meet. Got pregnant by a guy she hung out with for one night. And who is? Anthony. A wealthy young man who has more than a handful like her. If I get laid off, what am I going to raise the baby on? Nancy asked, looking at the wall. Who would need me with a child? And she knew the answers. I hadn't even graduated from college yet. Jenna, what? Shut up, was sitting next to me. Also knew, but there was no one to advise. Nancy didn't want to tell her mother about it at all. She herself had grown up in a not very friendly, loving family and would hardly have been understood. She had, in fact, run away from home when she entered college and was happy to be so far away from home now. Here she was free, but she could only count on herself. There was no help at all. She did not want to go back to her small town, but she did not want to deprive herself of her child either. It was a vicious circle. It had always seemed to Nancy that such decisions were not difficult to make. It was supposed to depend on circumstances. In reality, she was at a crossroads. A child with Anthony, whom she realized that, yes, she had been in love with all these years, or eternal regret. She floundered in the end without being able to tell herself exactly what she wanted. But on the morning before the flight, Nancy changed her mind, and for the past few days, she hadn't regretted it. She was able to finish her thesis, continued working only much more carefully, and took slightly fewer shifts. Got a few responses for good jobs. And when she got to the institute one day, she ran into the auditorium with the biggest Anthony fan in their class. Did you hear that Anthony flew off to grad school abroad for a few months? You weren't with us at the club, were you? Then he told me. He said it's a great accelerated program. He needs to upgrade his qualifications for his job. Nancy sighed sadly as she told him what she was going through, and Nancy's own legs nearly buckled. Oh, I really didn't know. But good luck to him. Nancy couldn't even believe her own voice was still steady, that she hadn't cried and even managed to smile. The girl went on, saying something, asking something, but Nancy was no longer listening. Anthony owed her nothing, and she herself didn't ask him anything, but she thought that he had been back for a long time and that he hadn't offered to meet her because he didn't want to. And he must have just decided to have one last good time with her. Well, everyone can have flaws. She accepted that pretty quickly and moved on. Started getting ready to go into labor. Jenna, her new boyfriend, was there to help. Nancy didn't feel at all that it was harder for her to do anything, that she wouldn't pull it off. On the contrary, she had a lot of strength in her. She was mentally prepared for the birth of her daughter. What did she learn at the last muse? Of course, life could not be fitted into plans, and things might not have gone the way she had hoped, but she was sure she could cope. She had no regrets. The baby waited impatiently for her baby to start peeing, and she prepared very carefully for his appearance. She did not forget on her walks about proper nutrition. Of course, over time it became much harder for her to tie her shoelaces in uncomfortable sneakers, sleep more comfortably, and sadness sometimes sets in. But she stubbornly kept herself afloat, and when it was quite dreary, that Anthony would never know now that he had a child, she cheered herself up, even through sheer force. Although passing by store windows with new collections, on the contrary, upset that it all did not fit her now. But at least she was no longer alone. Now she had a meaning to life. A daughter, not yet born, but already madly loved. She decided to name her Maria. She had always loved that name. Nancy graduated from college, gave birth to a daughter, and was so immensely happy that she forgot all about her daughter, who after a while stopped writing altogether. Jenna did not leave her in a difficult moment and gave her such a great support, which touched the soul. They partied out of the dorm and rented an apartment in a new neighborhood. As far as the long money was not endless, and both searched hard for work, and so far it was not possible to find something decent. Nancy was happy to keep her part-time job as a waitress. Jenna was babysitting Maria and was happy to work part-time as well, but from home. The first months of motherhood proved difficult. Sometimes her daughter would cry at night, but that was rare. But still Nancy did not sleep well. Sometimes she was lost, not knowing how to properly care for her daughter. Sometimes she had no energy and was sad that she would have to carry the burden of everyday life alone. But over time, everything got better. She became nimbler, and her strength was slowly coming back. She got used to it and settled in. Yes, her life had suffered a change, but she looked at her baby girl who sang into her lullabies and sang her song, and her heart was filled with incredible warmth. And then, on the most ordinary day, Nancy got a call from her boss informing her that there was going to be a wedding out of town. Knowing the situation, he immediately suggested her as a candidate. It was a millionaire's wedding, and the pay offered was very, very good. Nancy went to the hairdresser's, had her hair dyed, cleaned herself up. After Maria was born, she had no time to take care of her appearance, and neither did she have the energy. She was tired. Motherhood was not easy, but Nancy was ready for it. Maria proved to be a joyfully calm baby. She stopped crying. Or maybe it was Nancy who had learned to calm her quickly, to understand what her daughter wanted, but she still decided to hide her face with her glasses. She looked very tired already. And the supervisor specified that everyone should look good. Not ordinary people will be served, you see. Nancy immediately thought that Anthony really was different from everyone else. He never boasted of his condition. Nancy arrived in advance, tablecloth style, handing out plates, folding the place settings. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed the names of newlyweds Anthony and Elisa above the table, and sighed the thought that she might marry Anthony crept into her mind. But there was a lot to do, and she quickly forgot about it. And when the guests began to gather, there wasn't much to do at all. There were a lot of people, and it was noisy, but everything was very beautifully pioneered in delicate shades. Light airy. Nancy had been to many weddings and could tell the difference in price and quality. She was so run in with the plates that she didn't even get a chance to look at the young people, though they were rather odd. But everyone was on their own with their guests and relatives, and they didn't even seem to go together, just for pictures together. The bride, a lush cream with a train, caused everyone's delight, but Nancy saw the groom only from the back. But when the young couple's minute ran out, just as the parents began to congratulate them, she certainly didn't miss the opportunity to get a good look at them. It was a good thing the plates she was changing for the guests weren't on the tray yet. Standing next to the beautiful bride, Elisa, was Anthony. Anthony, who was the father of her child. And apparently Nancy was so thoughtful that she stood in the same pose for too long that she noticed Anthony looking at her from the other end of the huge hall. It was hard to know if he was seeing her for sure. And she didn't happen that way on purpose either. Now she was wearing her glasses in disguise, but as quickly as possible, gathering up her plates, she ran into the kitchen, not to go out or show her face again. It was not an option. Except how she slipped outside from the roof of everyone behind the crates and carts. She cried. She never nurtured dreams of what it might be like to be together with Anthony. The fleeting visions of them together were only in moments of despair. She always understood everything, and they hadn't seen each other for almost a year. Of course, Anthony could and should have had a bride, but only that resentment was not begging. But Nancy couldn't blame anyone. She had made that decision herself. Should she have taken it upon herself to say, without explanation, that she was pregnant back when they were communicating? She didn't know for sure, yes, and she didn't like to think about what had already been done. Why should she? If she hadn't already said it. Anthony was already married. He cried for a few minutes, finding the strength. After all, that money she had been promised to pay. She and Jenna could spend it on a month's rent. It warmed her soul. She didn't think it would hurt this much, but getting over those feelings did, needing to understand that their paths had parted. As luck would have it, she had to leave the hall more and more often. There were a lot of tables, and everywhere there was something to do. Good thing there were a lot of columns in that huge hall, behind which she hid perfectly, whenever Anthony was in sight. But here someone spilled wine on the tablecloth and not very politely told Nancy to clean it up. There was nothing to do. I had to fiddle around. As luck would have it, Anthony was there. She hadn't had time to take the tablecloth off yet, and found no better way to do it than to poke it under the table. Deftly and quickly, she thought. The only thing that cheered her up in this strangely absurd, ridiculous situation was that perhaps, years from now, she would remember the incident with a laugh. Not so. Just as she lifted the tablecloth to see if Anthony had left, his face immediately appeared before her. Who are we hiding from? Anthony was smiling through his teeth and looked so happy. Nancy's heart ached. But of course, he was at his wedding, and his bride was so perfectly slender, tall, with the perfect smile. I just dropped it here. Nancy rested her hands ridiculously on the floor, helped to find. Anthony only had wanted to sneak up on her like a girl, even kicked him back out a little roughly. And she crawled out from under the table herself. Nancy, don't tell me you don't recognize me. Anthony didn't move away. And Nancy felt like everyone was already looking at them. It's very ugly. If the groom at his own wedding is not spending time with his bride. Okay, family, friends, but certainly not with a waitress. Nancy wasn't ready to talk. And what could they talk about? Anthony, married. Had children with anyone? No, it doesn't matter anymore. Destroying someone else's marriage with this information. Nancy wasn't going to. She probably would have. What if she said something she didn't want to say? She hadn't really wanted to talk before. Now she was glad she didn't. Chances were Anthony had already been engaged when they'd met at the club. That would be on him. Nancy had nothing to do with it. My name is Anna. And so she said what she thought was the only right thing to do. She adjusted her waiter's uniform vest as a way to keep her hands busy and not give away her crazy excitement. She assured herself that she wasn't upset by any of this. But of course, that was a lie. It was hard for her. She didn't want to believe that there was nothing at all between him and Anthony. Was there? But Anthony's smile never came off. But where all the life in the kitchen suddenly came from the right. And Nancy remembered why she was even here. It was the best, if not the only way to get away from her smiling fiancé. Sorry, no need to go. So she immediately disappeared into the darkness of the column, leaving a dirty tablecloth on the table. Anthony got married. That was it. Now they would definitely never be together again. Nancy looked at the bride in the fancy dress and could not even find envy or hatred for that girl. For some reason, she herself didn't understand why she had let go of her dreams of Anthony. She had other problems now. She even tricked him by making him look ridiculous, like he was wrong. She hid from him the rest of the evening. Now, being more circumspect, he didn't seem to give up trying to find her. But there were so many people at this millionaire wedding. It was dancing time, and Nancy managed to get out of sight. As she got to work, she immediately hailed a cab and drove home, crying all the way. Did something happen to you? Even asked the concerned cab driver. Yes, but everything is fine. Sniffles. Nancy. Things of the heart are always like that. It will get easier with time. And she was in agreement with the cab driver's words. She just needed to get over it, and for it to get easier. She had completely disappeared from Anthony's life forever, but she was still incredibly happy with what was once between them. How many people get the chance to be around those with whom they are in love, who occupy all their thoughts completely, if only for a little while? Anthony even gave her the opportunity to be a mother. Maria looked like Nancy, but her eyes were definitely like Anthony's. Why don't you try to get a job at his firm? If he knew you, I'll take advantage of it and get a good job. Jenna, after hearing all about it, immediately made her conclusions, because I don't want to. Nancy shrieked. What firm? She could barely get away from Anthony's molestation at the wedding. What if they kept running into each other? Maybe he'd take her on for old time's sake, but then he'd have to talk to her. Nancy didn't want that at all. She still felt guilty that she hadn't told him about her pregnancy in time. But to tell this hour seemed even more foolish. Why hadn't you told him about the baby in the first place? Jenna only added fuel to the fire by rocking Maria in her arms and feeding her from a bottle. Even though Jenna didn't have children either, she handled Maria very well, because I knew from the beginning that there was no future with him. I was in love with him and everything, and I'm glad I was able to spend one night with him. I got what I wanted, and I'm madly grateful for it, Nancy summed up. She wanted to end this conversation, and if he wanted to be involved in the child's life, Jenna never said so, and she didn't judge her friend. But now, hearing her thoughts from another person made Nancy completely snicker. Overwhelmed, what else could she say now? I didn't want to and don't want to get my hopes up that he might one day be mine. He's married. Let's forget about it. Nancy thought she had certainly outlived her love by now. And now, when she saw Anthony, she didn't feel that she still liked him before, but in a very different way than the quieter realization. And she knew she shouldn't be in his life. All that remained in her heart was warmth and beautiful memories of the night she and Anthony had been together. The sleepless nights of tantrums and prayers, and again and after, were long gone. She was free of those feelings. She was living a full life, or rather, almost lived. It was not easy to find a job as a former student. With no experience in her specialty, tired of the eternal search, she sat on a job search website, clicking on all vacancies in a row. And when she was already desperate, she received an invitation for an interview at the firm. Seeing notification in the mail, she shrieked. So this is great. Jenna just woke up. It was the weekend, but came running out of the bedroom in a jiffy. Where to? What was the position? She hung on Nancy's shoulder, peering into the laptop monitor of his company. Said the girls in unison as they read the message sent to the end. Come on, maybe he won't even recognize you, or pretend he doesn't. Do you think he remembers every girl he's slept with? Nancy would have been happy to agree, except she'd already seen for herself that he hadn't forgotten anything, and the intervening months were unlikely to have changed anything. He already knew. That doesn't convince me to go to work for them. Stop it. Unfortunately, Nancy didn't have much choice. Working late as a waitress was no longer an option. Little Maria had to be picked up, withdrawn. Jenna couldn't sit with her all the time. They didn't want to take the baby there anyway, because she wasn't even a year old yet. But the director made an exception, entering Nancy's situation, and the girl was able to carve out some time for herself to live and work. She got lost in other firms and still talked herself into going for an interview at Anthony's firm. That place was the first decent place where her resume and candidacy were even considered. She knew that the job search wasn't easy, but she didn't think it would be. Nancy hadn't had time to gain experience since graduation, and she wasn't even counting on anything very good out of a big paycheck. And in other circumstances, she would even have been insanely happy that such a reputable firm had offered her at least a tryout. Nancy still managed to force herself to confirm her attendance at the interview, and she was really going to go to it. The firm was huge, with many branches across the country, a tall glass tower, 65 stories. What was the likelihood that Anthony would even find out about her presence at his firm? There are a lot of employees there. It was unlikely that he knew everyone's personnel file. Unlikely that he himself walked around all the floors and remembered everyone's face. Jenna was right. She would have missed an amazing opportunity. If she had refused, she would have suffered all her life. She didn't have to explain anything to Anthony at all. And how was he supposed to know the baby was even his? At the interview she came to, exactly a minute to a minute, so as not to sit in the hallway and accidentally catch Anthony's eye. There were the standard questions. You have a lot of experience as a waiter, that's good. So you know how to talk to people. I nodded, and looking at her resume, a recruiter, but she didn't react much to the fact that she had a child. What is living? Nancy wasn't close either and just nodded. She was very polite and didn't ask any tricky questions. Nancy liked the firm. The office was beautiful and very comfortable to reach, even if it was a long way. She even thought it would be nice to be hired. You graduated from a good institute. That was welcomed. The girl rather spoke her mind, and apparently had already made up her mind. Her gut told her this, Nancy. It was the morning off, which Jenna had persuaded her to take. Nancy was lying in bed and had no intention of getting up. Maria slept next to her. She didn't cry at all at night now. And she was so wonderful and smart and beautiful. All Anthony. And when the phone rang, Nancy was so annoyed that she didn't even want to answer it at first, but she had to do it. It might have been a job call. I got hired at his firm. She appeared on Jenna's doorstep so suddenly that her friend dropped a cookie in her mug of tea. This is great, Jenna shrieked. I don't know if I should even think, don't you dare. The place is great. The pay is good. You said you liked it, right? Jenna was right about everything. Nancy had made up her own limitations and pushed herself away from good things all the time. But that was the kind of person she was. The problems with her low self-esteem she could not overcome, no matter what she thought or said. From day one, she ran to work with great joy, even though it was hard to part with Maria. Not seeing her daughter for so long was unaccustomed. She was bored, but she had a good, interesting position and wonderful colleagues. Found common ground, and diligent study at the Institute gave its fruits. Nancy even made small mistakes in the beginning, and after that she got completely involved. Everything was great. The work was good, easy, and exciting. There were no delays at work, which was important to her, and Nancy even thought life was getting better. But alas, one very ordinary day the bosses suddenly stopped by. She was typing on the computer, and at first she didn't even see Anthony and his secretary Leo appear near her department. All the colleagues immediately whispered from their seats and stood up. Nancy smiled, and it was the same here. Anthony's admirers had not diminished even after her marriage. She herself hid behind the monitor and pretended not to notice her bosses who entered. Nancy decided to go to the cafe for lunch. Downstairs in the building, she was now earning a steady income and had enough to live on, and she could certainly afford to eat a salad. There were plenty of people, and she finally felt at ease in her place. She was glad she worked at such a good firm. She could really do a lot here. But as she picked her lunch behind her, everyone whispered. Turning to the door, she turned pale. Anthony walked into the cafe. She still hadn't decided what she could even say to him after all, and not in front of the other employees. So grabbing her purse, she apologized to the cashier and raced for the elevators. Sometimes, bumping into her coworkers, Anthony may have noticed this escape of hers. It couldn't be done quietly, but at least she avoided talking to him. Young lady, have you forgotten? It came over her back, but she didn't stop. True, after 10 minutes, she was hiding in the bathroom. Returning to her workstation, she saw in front of her computer the very same salad she had not picked up in the cafe and a cup of coffee. One of her coworkers must have brought it. Everyone there had seen her escape. Nancy was running late. Maria was crying. She didn't want to get dressed, go to the nursery, and Nancy couldn't send her daughter, which she did. She had to be soothed and coaxed and beguiled. The elevators in the lobby, though there were many staff members, were not insignificant either. She didn't stop pressing the call button. Finally, when she ran into the elevator and the doors were about to close, someone's hand woke up and stopped them. Nancy stepped to the back of the cabin. Sure enough, it was Anthony. He was on the phone, typing something into a clipboard, and he was busy. His secretary greeted the girl quietly and didn't look at her anymore either. And Nancy realized at that moment that she had to hide herself somehow. She began to wear a medical mask when she went out in the hallway or came to work. Glasses became an integral part of her look. Hooded jackets were also great for hiding. She didn't wear all that in the office. It was all about the corner itself. It was stuffy in there. Behind the filing cabinet, she was invisible. Anthony went in a couple of times in the habit of looking through the monitors at what his employees were doing. He apparently didn't, and all of his visits went quietly. And at some point, Nancy calmed down. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe Anthony had once told the Human Resources Department to hire graduates from the school where he studied. Maybe he really had already forgotten her, or was offended, which would be better after her behavior at the wedding, and would not want anything more to do with her. One day at lunch, colleagues introduced Nancy to William. He worked in programming and seemed like an exceptionally smart guy to Nancy. Very, very humorous, though a little peculiar. Nancy saw in him what she really lacked in Anthony. They were from the same circle. They grew up in the same circumstances. They'd had the same games as kids. They had the same domestic problems now. But only now there was a new question in the office. No one knew that Nancy had a child. She wasn't hiding it. It was just that somehow the conversation never came up. She just hoped that William wouldn't be put off by it right away. After the whole thing with Anthony, she hadn't dated anyone, hadn't had the time, the opportunity, or the desire. And she was worried if she had even forgotten how. And herself on dates. But this time she decided not to keep quiet. Of course, most likely, after she told William about the baby, the whole office would find out. But that wasn't a crime. She lived in the modern world and could give birth to whomever she wanted, whenever she wanted. She was a good mother, even though she gave birth to Maria at a very difficult time in her life. She never complained about her choices and enjoyed raising her daughter. Nancy herself spent all her free time with her daughter, always there when she needed her company or just a hug. Maria was growing up so fast, already beginning to speak her first words and trying to walk. She loved spending time with her daughter and often watched cartoons with her or cooked with her daughter sitting down. Nearby, she read her developmental books, bought her games and toys. She always put her to bed by herself. Only occasionally did Jenna sit with her now. Nancy went for walks with her, told her about the world around her, took her to children's concerts and plays, always trying to show her daughter new things. When she made the decision to have Maria, she was, as always, confident in what she was doing. Nancy loved her daughter above all else and always tried to be the best mom for her. In spite of all the challenges, Nancy never let her daughter feel lacking or insecure about the future. She always kept a smile on her face when she was around Maria and taught her to love life and believe in herself. And Maria herself turned out to be a very talented, intelligent girl. Intelligent, curious, and not at all cranky. The only thing that kept Nancy from working quietly was the constant thought that if Anthony was angry with her for her behavior, after all, she might well be fired for any mistake. That was partly why she was trying to hide, to keep her superior's eyes off her. Maybe Anthony had hired her out of an old friendship, but that didn't mean he had any warm feelings for her. Anthony was increasingly in sight, and Nancy had to become more selective about where she could lurk. One day, noticing Anthony walking toward their office again, where she was, as luck would have it, alone, she came up with nothing better than to hide in the nearest metal shelf cabinet. Along with him in the closet were folders of stationery and a large stack of papers, which provided her with an easy hiding place. She barely had time to close the door before Anthony walked into the office and found no one there. Decided, apparently, to stay waiting. The first colleagues who entered were surprised. "Good afternoon. Can you tell me where Nancy is?" They were taken aback even more by Anthony's question. "Hello, Anthony. Unfortunately, we don't have the faintest idea. Usually Nancy is always here. She doesn't go out much at all." The colleagues shrugged their shoulders. Meanwhile, Nancy was quietly hiding in the closet, watching the spectacle. But work time was not endless, even with the boss, and Anthony had to leave. But most importantly, colleagues followed him in an attempt to find out why he needed Nancy and suggestions. Tell her he stopped by. So the girl was able to get out of her hiding place without explaining herself to her colleagues, and they didn't exist. It would be impossible to explain why she hid from her superiors in the closet. For weeks on end, Nancy found great excuses for herself instead of walking away from any contact with Anthony every time. One time she pretended to be a plant, hiding behind a large flower pot. Anthony came by several times, not even realizing that Nancy was hiding nearby. The word wife was like a taboo to her. It had been that way before, but since she was a child until one day she witnessed a conversation in the restroom. You heard, Anthony is divorcing his wife. The women's room is the best place to listen to news, opinions, and gossip about everything around the staff. And Nancy became insanely slow in washing her hands, wiping, fixing her makeup, just to listen longer. She had to change her style a little, to start wearing skirts, pants, blouses, sometimes even dresses, and even makeup. She didn't want to be the white sheep as usual. She never had the money. Beautiful, expensive things. But now a lot has changed. Really. They've been married a couple of months. Gossip Girl's friend got mad. Said they had a huge fight. She wanted kids, and he didn't even come home all night. I thought Anthony was a good family man, that he wouldn't act like that. I'm shocked at all. Nancy wanted to yell that she was shocked, too, but remembered that she shouldn't care. However, the two gossip and talk Nancy listened to and couldn't believe. Didn't mind sharing this information with everyone entering the bathroom. Nancy didn't remember finishing work, only realizing what was going on around her when she walked darker from the street to the subway. It could be that Anthony's marriage was just an impulsive, rash act, and there was no other subtext in his dissolution. Of course, there could have been, and there was. Nancy calmed down a bit. They both had their own lives long ago, and she seemed as obsessed with Anthony as all his groupies, thinking about him all the time. She has her own life. Daughter has a date appointment with William. A lot of business at work and everyday life. Anthony, into these plans, no longer had to fit. But once the information that Anthony was getting a divorce reached every floor of their office and turned out to be true, Nancy began to feel a real gaze on her already. Anthony was constantly being around because of her successes. At work, she began to frequent the supervisor's floor and occasionally bumped into Anthony's gaze, and it wasn't easy to withstand. She still wore a medical mask and glasses and crossed her fingers behind her back every time so that Anthony wouldn't recognize her. Worked Nancy, and really well. She made increasing strides in each new project and eventually was chosen to be the head of the department. Presenting a presentation of their work at the week-long meeting. I don't think a public presentation is mine. Pyotr Mikhailovich, Nancy tried to the last minute to talk the head of the department out of this idea. But these are your ideas. Who can present them better than you? But all attempts were in vain. Besides, I didn't want to draw attention to myself by refusing completely. It would be very strange that an employee wouldn't want to brag about her ideas for improving the project. She had to agree, but she had no idea what to do. Anthony shouldn't have recognized her, especially now that she really needed the job because of her divorce. Jenna's advice was to just pretend that she really didn't know who her boss was and focus only on her presentation. But Nancy wasn't sure she had the self-control to do that, and she doubted that this hiding could go on long enough at all. She was nervous enough before the presentation that she'd freeze, that she'd make a mistake or forget something, and her palms were sweating as she waited her turn. And when she was invited to the screen, where the first title page of the presentation was already open, she was afraid she was going to fall from fear while her feet were walking, almost unheeding her. "Take off your mask," suddenly said. All this time from the beginning of the meeting silent. Anthony, Nancy had forgotten all about everything. "I can't," whispered the girl. Can't you hear well?" But Anthony stood his ground. "I am sorry. I have a cold. I don't want to infect anyone." They looked into each other's eyes. Nancy knew she was recognized and remembered, and something clearly wanted from her. The boss sighed heavily. He was silent for a few seconds, but then he nodded. "Then go on." Anthony looked away and stared at his clipboard. Nancy managed to get away with it this time. But when she calmly carried the files to the planning department, and only when she got out of the elevator, walking down the corridor, did she see that Anthony was heading straight in her direction. He hesitated again. She stared, trying to think of a cunning escape plan. She didn't notice that she was standing and bumped her thigh against him with all her might. The slippers flew out of her hands, scattered on the floor, hitting the staff, and even getting under them. We were already close to the face of his offended. The look on her eyes, the bump on her forehead was enough to understand this ridiculous protracted game. It had to end. She was an adult. Anthony had been divorced for a couple of months and had no idea she had a daughter by him. Hiding from him was useless. She was standing in front of him without her saving image, and she knew he had a lot to say to each other, and she hoped the fortunate occasion had come up. She was called right into Anthony's office, but from the threshold to pretend that they were best friends, she could not, of course, and waited to see what the boss would say first. "Good afternoon, Nancy." He was sitting at his practically empty desk with only a computer, a picture frame, tablets, and a small working pendulum. Nancy decided to focus her attention on him. Yes, anything, as long as she wasn't looking. On Anthony more and more. With each passing day, she felt guilty for not telling him about Maria, and insanely stupid from the way she hid from him then at the wedding, and all over the office now. And she realized clearly already that Anthony didn't hate her. There was no anger. He didn't know how to approach it. He was discouraged. After all, she had been running from him all along, but he was still rich and successful. And now that class distinction had been added to it. And the fact that he was her boss didn't bring them back that easy, no strings attached relationship anymore. "Good afternoon, Anthony." Nancy answered quietly. "I heard about your amazing success in the new place and wanted to meet you. We, judging by your resume, studied at the same institute, didn't we?" Yes, I guess Nancy was taken aback, but didn't say anything about it, and answered the point. "What do you think of the firm? How's the staff?" Anthony leaned back in his chair, folded his arms on his stomach. "Everything is great. I'm happy to work here." And Nancy shifted from foot to foot in front of the desk, as if she were being praised. "Counting, are you getting into it quickly? No problems?" "No, I've got it all figured out," nodded the girl. "What great news. And how does the bosses suit you?" Anthony continued to ask questions, and in his tone she caught a hint of sarcasm. And when she looked up, she saw that yes, he was smirking. It was a good sign. So she reckoned. The bosses started watching me a lot. I wondered if I'd done something wrong, and I decided to look a little too. Their relationship was already going beyond boundaries. Ah, that's it. But is it up to the bosses to keep an eye on you or not? Do you work as hard as you do? Have a good weekend. Suddenly, Anthony replied sharply and then stopped smirking. And to you, Nancy walked out of the office under the curious gaze of her secretary and personal assistant with shaking hands. She didn't realize what she had said wrong. Maybe he was really getting sick of her behavior, though. And of course, after the weekend, everyone was judging that Nancy was catching up with her superiors. Anthony, as it turned out, had a reputation for being strict and demanding. No one joked with him or allowed him to be flippant, but he could argue and innovate projects, and he was happy to take such an initiative. Nancy considered these to be the best qualities for a boss. Maybe it was the secretary who told her about being in the office, or maybe she looked confused when she returned to the office. But now her colleagues were also looking at her, but that was too much for her. Life was not, in her opinion, supposed to become like a soap opera. But that's exactly how it turned out. But as it was, she wasn't hiding anymore. Anthony did not pass in silence. Looking like a prey, He began to talk to her in front of everyone, which added fuel to the gossip already the whole office, even to those who were not initially interested. "Good afternoon, Nancy. Bon appetit." Anthony stopped next to her desk in the cafeteria. "Thank you." Nancy almost choked on it, too. And now, after a long time, she again saw that smile of Anthony's that had once won her over. But to dream of the past, to indulge in nostalgia, nosy colleagues prevented her from doing so. "Do you know each other?" Immediately swooped at her with questions as her boss stepped back. "We went to the same university, but we do not know each other." A true lie, like her whole life. "But she didn't have to tell anyone anything. And I thought he divorced his wife because of you." Suddenly, the youngest girl in their department said. Everyone immediately looked at Nancy again. "And I heard he was forced to marry that girl so he wouldn't be with our Nancy." Did I think he did it out of spite after they broke up to get back at Nancy? That I had nothing to do with it at all? She only chuckled nervously and really hoped that in reality that wasn't the case. That's what everyone says. If everyone says it, then it must be true. Yeah, that's usually how it works. It usually turns out that all the gossip was true. The horror. The rich always stick together. I'm not on that list. What kind of nonsense is that? Nancy knew her excuses were bad, but she couldn't think of any other. She herself didn't want to believe it was possible that Anthony ended up divorcing his wife because of her. And things began to go quietly and measuredly. The new project was long and garbage, and she wrote the report on it even at home, because she didn't have time to figure it out at work. With her foot, she rocked Maria's crib while she continued working, but she felt the happiest in the world. "Your report is no good. It will redo everything." She was told to take the report right away, and as soon as she finished it. And so he gave it back to her with barely a glance. "But you said you liked the way I worked." Nancy, of course, took the folder with the report, but it was, in her opinion, no different from the previous ones except in the number of pages. "When have I not remembered such a thing?" "You are indisputable here," frowns Anthony. She has not yet seen. "No, Anthony, I will redo it." She really didn't argue. Maybe she made some mistakes. It was a lot of work, and nobody canceled the human factor. Nancy spent all her energy on that report, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't find any major flaws. She sat over it for days and nights and spent less time with Maria, and very much suffered from it. But there was nowhere to go. Of course, he could see what she had done wrong. For a reason, he continues to run the firm, and does so with great success. Now she had a chance to see for herself what kind of grip he had. A smart businessman. She rearranged the items on the list in the report and brought it back to her superiors for approval of the redesign. Anthony was also stern. This time, just looking at the first page. "You didn't even look at it." But Anthony didn't respond. He twisted everything in his chair and stared at the clipboard with a sly smile. The conversation was over. Redo. Nancy lost count of the number of times it had been said. She even had colleagues helping her already. The head of the department himself had taken to rereading everything and was surprised to find no mistakes at all. But she couldn't get angry and swear at Anthony. He was, after all, the director of the firm. "Would you be so kind as to explain in detail what I have to redo?" She mustered all her charm and composure. She had other work to do too, and there was no way she could spend all her time on the report alone. "And I don't have to explain," Anthony brushed her off. The girl only pressed her lips, took her hateful bill, and after leaving the office, she just screamed with anger. In the morning, the letter arrived at her work email that her report was approved. Good thing she was home. Jenna was there too. Nancy already had to be reassured by such unflattering words to her. Anthony had certainly never heard them, not even behind her back. But all the neighbors must have heard it. But Anthony did stop sneering, and work returned to normal, right up until Nancy decided to talk to William in the break room. He was apparently going to ask her out, but didn't get around to it. Anthony looked menacing when he was next to them. and William quickly retreated without even saying goodbye and leaving his cup of coffee on the table. "Are you having an affair at work?" Eyes Anthony. "No," Nancy answered honestly. They hadn't even been on a single date yet. She was about to call William herself. The guy was kind of infantile. "What is this guy always doing around you? Does he like you?" Anthony, "He did. I didn't think about him liking me." Nancy online blushed. "I don't welcome that." Anthony stood his ground, and not to cause another pest attack on his superiors. Nancy nodded. Anthony reminded her of the sort of a learned, resentful boy. He did her little nasty things and was pleased with himself. This time, too, he paid off his chest like a turkey and walked away. But Nancy soon realized that William was put off by this situation for good. Nancy stayed late at work with another report. She did not want to find herself again in that peculiar game of Anthony, where he could bully her all he pleased, which in general was nothing but the use of his official position. She lost her tired eyes, the size of her neck from hours of sitting at the computer continuously. Her head was no longer boiling. The girl decided she'd had enough of mocking herself. Enough was enough from Anthony, and began to get ready to go home. The subway was still running, and she would catch one of the last trains for the first time. But walking down the deserted street alone was a little scary, when suddenly a car pulled up beside her before she could even leave the office grounds. A beautiful, black, shiny car. Nancy didn't know anything about cars, but even her distant self was interested in such a car. The window lowered, and behind it was Anthony's satisfied face. "We pay for recycling, but morally it's not very good." "I didn't force you," Anthony began, and Nancy only rolled her eyes. They weren't at work anymore, and Nancy decided not to answer anything at all. She continued on her way to the subway. "Nancy, where am I taking you?" "Get in." Anthony did not let up, walking slowly in the car behind her, and Nancy was sure to send him away. It was a great way to give him an indecent middle finger and be done with it, or maybe even get the job done. But no sooner had she reacted than a dubious company showed up in the distance. Of course, it was unlikely she would have been molested even in the evening, but near a bunch of office buildings, where people still worked. Specifically in their tower, there were lights in the many windows on the various floors. But she still decided not to tempt fate. She was poked and prodded by a beautiful, expensive Anthony's car. It was the kind of car she had never been in before. It even had a leather interior. She gave her address and did not engage in further dialogue. Anthony was talking to himself, asked her some simple questions about the weather, about her mood, about the places they passed. Had she been to those stores, cafes, shopping malls? But all of them Nancy left unanswered. At some point, of course, she gave up and smiled, and even though it was dark in the cabin, Anthony, of course, saw it. And the next day, he finished a new countdown, and under the already suspicious glances of her colleagues, who definitely did not believe her, she carried it again to the offices of her superiors. Anthony scrutinized them all, offering her to sit and wait, and then gave out, "You bore me." Nancy, the girl, was taken aback that and even jumped up from her chair. "I think you have had enough all the time." She reached Anthony's words for a few seconds. "My bastard, and your houses prevent me to build a personal life." Nancy decided not to be modest in front of him anymore. He turned out to be so mean, her strength was gone. "Go to work." Anthony slammed the report folder shut and set it aside in a drawer. He let her go, but Nancy was glad for this outcome. Nothing needed to be redone. And as soon as the last day of work before the weekend was over, she hurried to the nursery for Maria. She decided to take her daughter for a walk in the park, bought her a couple of toys that her daughter wanted, and even listened to her childish indignation. Not quite sure what content, but definitely the boy sat down and concluded that all men are the same. On Monday morning and all the days that followed, a cab started standing outside her house to take her to work. And even though it had been ordered from a firm, she knew who was in it. Nancy was promoted. She began to attend meetings where Anthony kept his eyes on her, which paid new gossip. He complimented her on her work, well veiled at every meeting, and sent her bouquets of flowers to her office every day. Colleagues wondered if it was William, but then they finally leaned toward Anthony, and Nancy began to hear more and more that she was the one who had been separated, and their boss's marriage had broken up because of her. Her personal space had been violated, and she didn't know what to do. Those whispers behind her back were preventing her from working fully. So, unable to stand it, she went back to Anthony's office. "Good afternoon. Wrap it up." Nancy started from the doorway, and she didn't care that actually, despite all their childish, inexplicable to adults teasing, he was still her boss. And then it suddenly dawned on her that these jokes were not on the level, and their behavior was still as explainable to those who were in love. But she wasn't in love with Anthony, or was there something to finish? Now it was Anthony's turn not to understand the reproach. "Are you making everyone accuse me of damn things? I don't feel comfortable here. Everyone is whispering behind my back, and it's not my fault." Nancy blurted out, "Why did you start ignoring me?" Suddenly, a completely different Anthony answered, "How much were you paid?" "It's Elisa. My parents." Someone from the table came up to her, took her palms in his. "You pretended at the wedding that you didn't know me. You didn't want to see me. No one paid me. You're a millionaire. And I am me. You went away to study. We don't talk much anymore. That's normal. And then you got married, and I didn't even accidentally want to interfere with your love and your marriage. The worst marriage possible. I wanted a divorce as soon as I said I agreed." Anthony shook his head. Though Nancy began to feel sorry for him, she knew they were too messed up for any kind of relationship. Besides, she had one growing secret from Anthony. "But that was your problem. You chose your own wife, didn't you?" The girl shrugged her shoulders. Anthony grinned. "Okay, I promise not to act like an ass anymore, and not to set you up in the workplace. But not in the workplace. I can't promise anything." On the whole, that answer was satisfactory to Nancy. "I was hired here because of you." Still dared to ask the girl. The situation was appropriate, and as it were, she wanted to leave this office. She did not want to let go of Anthony's hand. She had already forgotten what it was like to hold his hand and be so close to him in general. They were the only ones here, and old feelings seemed to be starting to come alive. That was all she needed. Well, no offense, of course, but few people need students without experience. Anthony answered honestly. "I look at every candidate for every position. I keep an eye on everything here. And that's why our firm runs so smoothly and brings in great profits." They'd grown close again. As much as Nancy didn't want them to, they couldn't be called just colleagues after that conversation. But at least Anthony kept his promise and stopped this circus at work. But instead, he picked up and drove to the front door of her house as she was just coming back from her walk with Maria on her day off. The girl was startled by an obscure uncle with a huge bouquet who approached them from car. Anthony looked tonally at Maria, then held out the bouquet of roses. "Thank you. It is very beautiful." Nancy gladly accepted the flowers. "Why not? Your daughter?" Finally, Anthony asked. The girl nodded, and Maria showed the unfamiliar uncle her tongue. "So you have someone else?" Sadly, Anthony continued with his head down, but with a furtive look, apparently hoping to get a negative answer, and having heard it, started to ask a lot of questions. "Then who is the father?" "I know him." He grabbed Nancy by the shoulders. "What do you care?" Crossing her arms over her chest, the girl pulled him away and adjusted her riding beret on her head. "I need to know who her father is so I can try to replace him." "Why?" Nancy's mouth almost opened in shock. She had never imagined that Anthony's intentions could be so serious. "I want to be with you. And of course, your daughter must like me." "What for?" Anthony continued. His voice was firm. Nancy knew that no better chance would come her way. That she actually, of course, wanted him to know her child existed. that she was too young when she got pregnant, that she was scared and confused, that she had absolutely no self-confidence and had made so many mistakes that it seemed impossible to correct. But in front of her was Anthony. He looked into her eyes and wanted so badly to be there, to be a part of their little family. And so Nancy finally mustered up the courage to say she was your daughter. In the height of the autumn wind sent the yellowing of the most beautiful crowns of trees. People walked by, drove by, cars developed, handed their coats. And Nancy and Anthony stood in the middle of the street, looking into each other's eyes and saying nothing more. Words from there were of no use at all. They had a lot of time ahead of them. Anthony wanted to be with Nancy. She convinced herself that she could get rid of the doubt that they could not be together. Because of the difference in their situation, fate had brought them together long ago, and she didn't understand why these two didn't want to be together. Nancy knew she'd overplayed her hand. She had a child with Anthony, after all, and hiding and acting like she didn't know who she was stupid. So much time. But maybe now they could change things. Maria got a little bolder and stepped out from behind her mother and held out her little hand for a handshake to the still unfamiliar uncle. Anthony squatted down and looked into his daughter's eyes, so much like his own, and all doubt in his soul fell away. For now, they were a long way from being able to tell the whole world that they were now together forever. But they had already taken the first step toward it. They had opened their souls to each other. And maybe the day would come very soon when they would both dare to say "I love" with confidence.